The flute is very heavy on one side. So the mechanics of the flute mean that we've got a lot of keywork all down this side, a lot of bars, not so much on this side. So I know you'll be looking at my flute and thinking, what is that? And this is an alternative low C sharp. So just to satisfy your curiosity there. But what we're talking about right now is the degree of metalwork on this side of the flute as opposed to this side. So if I hold the flute in my hands and release my thumbs, this is how most people hold the flute with the keywork facing upright. If I release my thumbs, it's going to roll over every time because it's just so heavy on this side. You may have memories of this when you're a kid struggling to hold the flute. Anybody who teaches deals with this every time they're dealing with young people because they don't have much finger strength. And it's quite a battle to find a situation where they can keep the embouchure hole open enough and fight this tendency of the flute rolling over all the time. Most people start off with trying to play the flute like this, with the keywork facing upright. This is the most popular way of playing the flute, in my observation. And because it wants to dive, that requires a certain amount of horizontal pressure to hold it steady. So when this is going well, someone's thumb is kind of pointing this direction, pushing the flute in front of them. And this part of the hand, the base of the left hand index, will be an opposite force. It's pushing back. So I've got my right hand thumb pushing that way, base of the index finger pushing this way. And the third point of that, of course, is your chin. So it should look something like that. It's important to think about all the fingers that are going to move being free. And you can see I can wiggle all of the fingers that are going to move quite easily. But I'm very aware of the fact that I'm pushing with my right hand thumb this direction, and I'm pushing with this that way. So a problem with this can be that people wind up pushing the flute forward with their little finger. That happens when the thumb is too far underneath the flute and there's not enough thumb stuff here to contribute enough to pushing. So the little finger takes over. And before I talked about the tension that can happen in this hand as a result of gripping the flute badly, this is what can contribute to that. So here I've got my little finger doing the pushing, and already just from holding the flute like that, I can feel the tension going in this part of my hand. So if you're wanting to play the flute in this way, really, really think about what your thumb is doing and see if you can get it more on the back of the flute. It will take care of this problem, and then you'll be able to ease up on your little finger. I think another slight issue with this way of holding the flute is that it's hard to moderate how much we push. So when you're pushing here, then you're going to push more here, and then you're going to push more here. And then that can turn into a vicious circle of pushing more all over. And I've seen some people complain about pain actually in this muscle here, because that's helping to push your head forward to combat all this pushing. I did this myself when I was a kid, and I pushed my flute so much that it was actually a banana shape by the time I sold it. If I lined it up on the top of a piano, you could see this end would touch, this end would touch, which is quite a feat really, because this is actually in parabola shapes and should be smaller at that end, and there would be a big gap between the middle of the flute. And that was me just pushing it out of round. So now I'd like to talk about a method of holding the flute that I learned from Wilfred Kuchela. There's also a great article by Alexander Murray, who was a Renaissance man with the flute. Alexander, a technique expert, and also designed a flute. Both of these gentlemen have spent a lot of time thinking about how the balance of the flute works in your hands. And their solution to a lot of technique problems is to actually find a point where the flute is balanced and doesn't need quite so much push to hold it steady. So they talk about rotating the flute around so that the heavy part is more on top. So you can see now, I can lift my fingers off, and hopefully we're pretty close to the flute just staying steady. Here we are. My flute is a Broger mechanic, meaning it's got a tremendous amount of metalwork up the back here instead of pins. If you play a traditional mechanic flute with pins in it, this side won't be as heavy, and the degree of roll required to find a balance spot won't be as much. If you're going to work on this at home, I recommend keeping your thumbs pretty close so you can grab the flute, and do it over a bed or something soft in case it slips out of your hands. So having identified where that balance point is, then I have to align the head joint the way the head joint suits my face. For me, this is turned in somewhat. But remember, my ear angle is pretty steep. If my ear angle was straight, then I would have to turn the head joint in much further. It might even look something like that, which is a little unusual. I tell my students who play like this that, of course, they're going to encounter someone who's going to exclaim in horror that they can't possibly play the flute like that and they should roll the head joint out. And I think that that's, of course, a well-intentioned comment. It's just not really considering that the hand position might be different to how one plays into the head joint. So I guess my main point here is that the head joint needs to suit the individual, and it's really a separate issue to what we're doing with our hands. So getting back to this balance thing, this right-hand thumb can drop down a little bit more and be a little more underneath the flute, and my left hand can be a little bit more underneath the flute. With the right hand, I imagine my thumb is lifting the flute, and it's like a diagonal trajectory away from the flute. And this is the similar. I'm lifting and pointing that direction up. So it's mostly a lift. And the rest on my chin is a lot lighter because I haven't got the push involved. I feel like I could almost hold the flute without my chin there. Maybe not quite. Yeah, almost.